January 17, 1945. Stalag Luft III, Western Poland. The wind cuts through the wire like a blade through canvas. Inside Barracks 14, Oberst Friedrich Hartmann sits on a wooden bunk, hands folded in his lap, staring at a crumpled American magazine someone smuggled past the guards. The page is torn, but the photograph is clear. Rows of four-engine bombers stretching toward the horizon at an airfield somewhere in Kansas. Beneath the image, a caption reads, "One B-24 Liberator completed every 63 minutes." Hartmann had shot down 27 Allied aircraft over France and the Low Countries. He had flown the Messerschmitt Bf 109 with the precision of a surgeon and the aggression of a wolf. But now, in this frozen prisoner camp, surrounded by men who once ruled the skies over Europe, he reads that single sentence again and again. Every 63 minutes. He folds the magazine carefully as though handling something sacred or cursed, and whispers to the man beside him, "They are not fighting a war. They are operating a factory." For years, the Luftwaffe had been told they were the elite, the chosen instrument of German superiority, the steel edge of the Third Reich's ambition. They had flown over Poland, France, and Britain with confidence, believing that skill, courage, and the righteousness of their cause would overcome any material disadvantage. In the early years of the war, that belief seemed justified. German pilots racked up kill counts that stunned the world. Aces like Erich Hartmann, Hans-Joachim Marseille, and Gerhard Barkhorn became legends, their names whispered with reverence and fear. The Luftwaffe's fighters were faster, their tactics sharper, their pilots more experienced than almost anyone they faced. But by 1943, something had shifted. The bombers kept coming. No matter how many were shot down over the Ruhr, over Hamburg, over Berlin, more appeared the next day. And the next. And the next. The sky over Germany became a conveyor belt of American steel, each formation larger than the last, each raid more devastating. The aces who survived long enough to be captured began to understand a truth that shattered their understanding of warfare itself. They had been fighting men, but America had been building a machine. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator were not just aircraft. They were statements of industrial philosophy, monuments to a way of thinking that was alien to the German war machine. Where Germany built its bombers in small batches, with artisan-like attention to detail and constant modifications, America standardized, mechanized, and mass-produced. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, operated by Ford Motor Company, became the physical manifestation of this approach. Designed by Albert Kahn and constructed in less than a year, the facility stretched over 3.5 million square feet, making it the largest room under one roof in the world at the time. At its peak, Willow Run employed over 42,000 workers operating around the clock in 3 shifts. The assembly line was nearly a mile long, and bombers moved through it like automobiles in a Detroit factory. By 1944, the plant was producing one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. In a single month, Willow Run could build more bombers than Germany produced in an entire year. German intelligence officers studied these figures with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had famously dismissed American industrial capacity in the early years of the war, calling it exaggerated propaganda. In 1942 he reportedly told his staff, "The Americans cannot build planes, only razor blades and refrigerators." But by 1943, even Göring could not deny the evidence filling the skies over Europe. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, was more realistic. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote of the moment he understood the scale of American production. "We had been trying to win a 20th-century war with 19th-century methods. The Americans had turned warfare into an engineering problem, and they solved it the way they solved everything, with overwhelming resources and relentless efficiency." Speer's realization came too late. By the time Germany attempted to rationalize its aircraft production, the gap was insurmountable. The men who flew against these machines experienced the disparity not as statistics but as existential horror. Lieutenant Hans Philipp, a decorated fighter ace with over 200 victories, wrote in his diary in late 1943, "We are like men trying to empty the ocean with buckets. For every bomber we destroy, 10 more appear. Where are they coming from? How many factories do the Americans have? How many workers? How many tons of aluminum?" Philipp would be killed in action 2 months later, shot down during a daylight raid over Brandenburg. His questions would remain unanswered, but his fellow pilots began to piece together the truth through fragments of intelligence, captured documents, and the sheer overwhelming evidence of their own eyes. The Americans were not just outproducing Germany, They were operating on a scale that redefined what industrial warfare could be. To understand the shock experienced by German airmen, one must first understand what they expected. The Luftwaffe was born from the traditions of the First World War, where aerial combat was a contest of individual skill and mechanical excellence. The Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, had become a symbol of chivalry in the sky, and this romantic ideal persisted into the Second World War. German pilots were trained intensively, often flying hundreds of hours before entering combat. Their aircraft, particularly the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw 190, were superb machines, carefully engineered and deadly in the hands of skilled pilots. The expectation was that quality would triumph over quantity, that a small number of elite pilots and superior aircraft could dominate the skies through courage, discipline, and tactical brilliance. This belief was not entirely unfounded. In the opening years of the war, German fighters had decimated the air forces of Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Even during the Battle of Britain, despite ultimate defeat, Luftwaffe pilots inflicted severe losses on the Royal Air Force. The Germans took pride in their kill ratios, in the ACE system that celebrated individual achievement, in the Knight's Cross awarded to pilots who embodied martial excellence. But this system, for all its psychological power, rested on a fundamental miscalculation: the belief that war could still be won by heroes rather than factories. America approached the problem differently. When President Franklin Roosevelt called for the production of 50,000 aircraft in 1940, many thought the number was fantasy. Harold Ickes, Secretary of the Interior, supposedly asked, 50,000 planes? Where will we put them all? But Roosevelt understood something that the Axis powers did not. He understood that modern warfare was a contest of productive capacity, that the nation which could mobilize its industrial base most effectively would ultimately prevail. The United States possessed advantages that were almost difficult to comprehend. Vast natural resources, a population of over 130 million, geographic security from enemy bombing, and an industrial infrastructure unmatched anywhere in the world. What America lacked in military tradition, it compensated for with organizational genius and sheer material abundance. The transformation of American industry for war production remains one of the most astonishing achievements in human history. Companies that had never built aircraft retooled their factories within months. Ford, which had revolutionized automobile production with the assembly line, applied the same principles to bombers. General Motors, Chrysler, and hundreds of smaller firms joined the effort. The workforce expanded exponentially, drawing in women, minorities, and older workers who had been excluded from industrial jobs during peacetime. Rosie the Riveter became more than a propaganda symbol. She represented millions of real women who learned to operate drill presses, rivet guns, and welding torches, building machines that would darken the skies over Europe and the Pacific. The B-24 Liberator itself was a marvel of practical engineering. It was not the most beautiful aircraft ever built. Pilots often complained about its handling characteristics, and it lacked the graceful lines of the B-17. But it was effective, versatile, and crucially, it was designed for mass production. The B-24 featured innovations that simplified manufacturing: large, flat surfaces that could be fabricated in separate sections and then assembled, modular components that allowed for easy replacement and repair, and standardized parts that could be produced by multiple contractors. Over 18,000 B-24s were built during the war, more than any other American military aircraft. Each one carried up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, defended itself with 10.50 caliber machine guns, and could fly missions of over 2,000 miles. They were not elegant, but they were relentless. German pilots quickly learned to respect and then fear the American bomber formations. The combat box formation, pioneered by the 8th Air Force, turned individual bombers into a single defensive organism. Dozens of aircraft flew in tight, mutually supporting positions, their combined firepower creating overlapping fields of fire that could shred attacking fighters. Approaching a combat box was like flying into a storm of lead. Major Heinz Nock, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot, described the experience in his wartime memoir: "The sky becomes a wall of tracers. You pick your target, commit to the attack, and pray that you will live to see the end of your dive. Half the time, you don't even know if your cannon shells hit anything. You break away, and when you look back, the formation is still there, unchanged, as if your attack meant nothing at all." The psychological impact of this experience cannot be overstated. German pilots were trained to think of themselves as warriors, individual champions whose skill and courage made the difference between victory and defeat. But against the American bomber streams, individual skill seemed irrelevant. You could shoot down 3 bombers in a single mission, earn a medal and return the next day to find the formations even larger. The mathematics were brutal. Germany had roughly 3,000 operational fighters at the height of the strategic bombing campaign. America was producing over 7,000 aircraft per month across all types. For every German pilot who survived to become an ace, the Americans were building dozens of bombers. The war had become arithmetic, and Germany was on the wrong side of the equation. This realization dawned slowly, unevenly across the Luftwaffe. In 1942, many pilots still believed they could win. By 1943, the optimism had curdled into desperation. By 1944, even the propaganda could not conceal the truth. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. Replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with less than 50 hours of flight time, barely able to take off and land, let alone survive combat against experienced American escort fighters. The aces, those who had survived the grinding attrition of 3 years of warfare, found themselves flying multiple missions per day, exhausted, outnumbered, and increasingly aware that their efforts were futile. They kept fighting because they were soldiers, because their homeland was being bombed into rubble, because surrendering to despair meant betraying the men beside them. But the belief that courage and skill could overcome material disadvantage had died somewhere over the burning cities of the Ruhr. The captured German airmen in POW camps across Britain and America became students of a phenomenon they could barely comprehend. They read magazines and newspapers provided by the Red Cross. They attended lectures given by camp administrators about American history and industry. They watched newsreels showing American factories, farms, and cities untouched by war. What they saw challenged every assumption they had been taught about democracy, capitalism, and racial superiority. How could a nation of mongrels and plutocrats, as Nazi propaganda described America, outproduce the racially pure, disciplined Reich by a factor of 10? How could a society that valued individual freedom and profit-seeking create industrial coordination that made German central planning look amateurish? Some prisoners retreated into denial, insisting that the figures were exaggerated, that the newsreels were fabrications. But others, particularly the more educated officers, began to question the fundamental premises of National Socialism. If racial purity and authoritarian discipline were the keys to national strength, why was Germany losing? If democracy was weak and decadent, why was America so strong? These questions were dangerous even in a POW camp, but they could not be suppressed. Oberst Hartmann, staring at that photograph of bombers in Kansas, was confronting the collapse of his worldview. He had believed that German technology, German courage, and German will were superior. The evidence suggested otherwise. The bomber became a symbol, a physical manifestation of American abundance. German soldiers had grown accustomed to shortages: ersatz coffee, synthetic rubber, clothing made from wood pulp. They rationed fuel, ammunition, and food with obsessive care because there was never enough. But the Americans seemed to operate from a place of limitless plenty. Every captured American soldier had better boots, better rations, better equipment than his German counterpart. The bombers that filled the sky were just the most visible expression of this disparity. Each B-24 required 450,000 separate parts, 150,000 pounds of aluminum, and thousands of hours of skilled labor. America built over 18,000 of them. Germany, by comparison, produced approximately 6,000 Heinkel He-111 bombers during the entire war, and those were smaller, less capable aircraft. The contrast extended beyond mere numbers. American bombers were equipped with technologies that stunned German engineers when they examined captured or crashed aircraft. The Norden bomb sight, though not as accurate as American propaganda claimed, was still a marvel of precision engineering. Onboard oxygen systems allowed crews to operate at altitudes where German fighters struggled for performance. Heated flight suits, powered gun turrets, advanced navigation equipment. Every system reflected a design philosophy that prioritized crew survival and mission effectiveness over cost or production simplicity. The Germans had superior technology in some areas, particularly jet propulsion and rocketry, but they lacked the industrial base to deploy those innovations at scale. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was a revolutionary design. Germany built fewer than 1,400 of them. By contrast, America built over 12,000 P-51 Mustangs, a conventional propeller fighter that was good enough, cheap enough, and available in sufficient numbers to overwhelm any German advantage. This concept, good enough in overwhelming numbers, was alien to the German military mindset. German engineering culture prized perfection, elegance, and technical sophistication. Each tank, aircraft, or weapon system was a carefully crafted piece of technology, often modified and improved during production in response to field experience. This approach produced some of the finest military equipment of the war: the Tiger tank, the FW-190 fighter, the Type XXI U-boat. But it also produced bottlenecks, delays, and ultimately, defeat. The Tiger tank was arguably the best heavy tank of World War II, but Germany built only 1,347 of them. America built over 50,000 Sherman tanks. The Sherman was inferior in armor and firepower, but it was reliable, easy to maintain, and available in such numbers that German tankers called encounters with American armored divisions the death lottery. The bomber offensive brought this industrial disparity home in the most literal way possible. Starting in 1943, American and British bombers systematically destroyed Germany's industrial capacity. The 8th Air Force, based in England, flew daylight raids against aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, and transportation networks. The Royal Air Force struck by night, targeting cities and industrial centers with area bombing. The combined offensive, known as the Combined Bomber Offensive, represented the largest sustained air campaign in history. Between 1943 and 1945, Allied bombers dropped over 2.7 million tons of bombs on Germany and occupied Europe. The raids killed an estimated 410,000 German civilians, destroyed or damaged millions of homes, and reduced dozens of cities to ruins. German fighter pilots flew themselves to exhaustion trying to stop the attacks. They developed new tactics, new weapons, and new aircraft specifically designed to destroy heavy bombers. The FW-190 was equipped with heavy cannons and rocket launchers. The Me-410 carried 50mm anti-tank guns adapted for use against bombers. The Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor, could reach altitudes of 40,000 feet and speeds over 600 miles per hour, making it nearly impossible to intercept. But none of it mattered. For every tactical innovation, the Allies adapted. When German fighters began attacking from the front, where bomber defensive armament was weakest, the Americans added chin turrets to the B-17. When flak batteries forced bombers to fly higher, improved superchargers and oxygen systems allowed them to operate above 30,000 feet. And when the Luftwaffe concentrated its forces to achieve local air superiority, long-range escort fighters, P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and especially P-51 Mustangs, appeared to protect the bombers all the way to their targets and back. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang in late 1943 marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. Equipped with drop tanks that extended its range to over 1,600 miles, the Mustang could escort bombers deep into Germany and still have fuel for combat. American pilots, initially less experienced than their German counterparts, quickly learned to use their aircraft's advantages: speed, range, and above all, numbers. By 1944, the 8th Air Force could dispatch 1,000 bombers and 800 fighters on a single mission. The Luftwaffe could rarely muster more than 200 fighters in response. The result was not air combat in any traditional sense, it was slaughter. German pilots were shot down in droves, and those who survived one mission returned to base knowing they would face the same odds the next day, and the day after that, until they were killed, wounded, or captured. General-Lieutenant Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected fighter aces and commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, recognized the futility of the situation as early as 1943. In a report to Göring he wrote, "The Americans are conducting a war of attrition, and they have the resources to win it. We can shoot down 3 bombers for every fighter we lose, and we will still lose this war because they can replace their losses and we cannot." Galland's assessment was brutally accurate but politically dangerous. Göring, increasingly detached from reality, responded by accusing Galland and his pilots of cowardice. The disconnect between the leadership and the men doing the fighting grew into a chasm. Pilots stopped reporting their true feelings in official channels, but in diaries, letters, and private conversations the despair was evident. The diary of Oberleutnant Herbert Bauer, a fighter pilot killed over Berlin in March 1944, contains a passage that captures this despair. "We take off every morning knowing that most of us will not return. The Americans come in formations so large they darken the sun. Their fighters are everywhere and they show no mercy. Yesterday I watched Muller's plane explode. Today Schroeder did not return. Tomorrow perhaps it will be my turn. What are we dying for? To delay the inevitable by another day? I used to believe we were defending our homeland, our families, our future. Now I think we are dying because no one has the courage to admit that we have already lost." Bauer's question, "What are we dying for?" haunted the Luftwaffe in its final years. The obvious answer, defending Germany from strategic bombing, became increasingly hollow as the raids continued unabated. Cities burned, factories were destroyed, and the civilian population suffered immensely, but the bombers kept coming. The Luftwaffe's fighters, once the pride of the Third Reich, had been reduced to a last-ditch defense force, unable to protect the nation they had been created to serve. The psychological toll on the pilots was immense. Many developed what would now be recognized as combat stress reaction or post-traumatic stress disorder. Others turned to alcohol, morphine, or Pervitin, the methamphetamine distributed to German forces to combat fatigue. Some simply stopped caring, flying their missions mechanically, waiting for the inevitable end. But amid the despair, there were moments of clarity, instances when individual pilots understood the larger historical forces at work. Major Hans Trottloft, a veteran pilot and wing commander, wrote after the war about a conversation he had with a young pilot in early 1945. The pilot, barely 20 years old, had just returned from a mission where he had been the only survivor of his squadron. Trottloft asked him what he had learned. The pilot replied, "I learned that we are not fighting a war. We are being processed. The Americans have turned us into a problem to be solved, and they are solving us one sortie at a time." Trottloft found the comment disturbing but accurate. War, at least as the Luftwaffe had understood it, involved strategy, tactics, and human will. But the American bombing campaign had transcended those categories. It was industrial logic applied to destruction. Identify targets, allocate resources, execute missions, assess results, repeat. There was no glory in it, no heroism, just the relentless application of overwhelming force. This industrialization of warfare was not unique to the air campaign. The entire Allied war effort, particularly the American contribution, was characterized by a ruthless efficiency that shocked observers on both sides. German officers captured after the Battle of the Bulge spoke with awe about the speed with which American forces reconstituted shattered units. A division that had been mauled in combat would be withdrawn, resupplied, and returned to the front line in a matter of days. The Americans had trucks to move men and material, spare parts to repair damaged vehicles, and stockpiles of ammunition that seemed inexhaustible. German units, by contrast, often had to wait weeks for supplies that never arrived, relying on captured equipment and improvised repairs to remain operational. The symbolic weight of the bomber, particularly the four-engined heavy bomber, extended beyond its military function. It represented a vision of power that was fundamentally American, practical, overwhelming, and seemingly inexhaustible. Where the Germans built monuments to engineering excellence, the Americans built assembly lines. Where the Germans celebrated the individual ace, the Americans celebrated the crew, the factory worker, the supply sergeant. The bomber was not a weapon wielded by a hero, it was a tool operated by a team, maintained by a logistics network, and produced by an economy that treated warfare as just another industrial challenge. This difference in approach reflected deeper cultural and political differences. Nazi ideology emphasized struggle, sacrifice, and the triumph of will over material circumstances. The German people were told that their racial superiority and ideological commitment would compensate for any material disadvantages. But by 1944, this narrative had collapsed under the weight of lived reality. The soldiers at the front, the civilians in the cities, and the prisoners in the camps could see that will and ideology were no match for industrial capacity and organized logistics. The Americans and British were not superior warriors, they were superior organizers, and in modern warfare, organization mattered more than courage. Some German officers, particularly those who survived the war and reflected on their experiences, came to see American industrial power as almost apolitical, a force of nature rather than a human achievement. Albert Speer, in his Nuremberg testimony and later writings, described American production capacity in terms usually reserved for natural disasters or divine intervention. He spoke of the flood of American material and the avalanche of production, as if these were acts of God rather than the result of deliberate human planning and effort. This language revealed a cognitive inability to fully process what had happened. The Nazi worldview, with its emphasis on racial hierarchy and mystical concepts like blood and soil, had no framework for understanding how a diverse, democratic, capitalist society could outproduce an authoritarian regime specifically organized for total war. The answer, of course, was that democracy and capitalism, for all their flaws, were better suited to large-scale industrial mobilization than fascism. Democratic societies could harness individual initiative and innovation in ways that rigid hierarchies could not. Capitalist economies, driven by competition and profit, could scale production more efficiently than centrally planned systems burdened by corruption, infighting, and ideological constraints. The United States succeeded not despite its diversity and openness, but because of them. The engineers who designed the B-24 came from a dozen different ethnic backgrounds. The workers who built them included women, African Americans, and immigrants who would have been excluded or murdered in Nazi Germany. The supply chains that kept the bombers flying relied on resources from across the Western Hemisphere and beyond. American power was collaborative, improvisational, and utterly relentless. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the numbers told a story that no amount of propaganda could obscure. The United States had produced over 300,000 aircraft during the war, including 35,000 heavy bombers. Germany, despite a frantic effort to increase production in the final years of the war, managed approximately 119,000 aircraft total, and many of those never flew combat missions due to fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, or Allied bombing of airfields. In 1944 alone, American industry produced more aircraft than Germany had produced in the entire 6-year war. The disparity was so large that it rendered questions of individual skill or tactical brilliance almost irrelevant. Germany's aces, some of whom had over 200 confirmed kills, could not change the outcome because the outcome was determined in factories half a world away from the combat zone. The German airmen who spent the last months of the war in Allied prisoner camps had front-row seats to the consequences of this industrial disparity. They watched newsreels of American soldiers crossing the Rhine with pontoon bridges erected in hours, supported by seemingly endless columns of trucks, tanks, and artillery. They read accounts of Allied advances that covered more ground in weeks than German forces had managed in years. They heard stories from newly arrived prisoners about the final collapse, about units surrendering en masse because there was no fuel, no ammunition, and no hope. And through it all, they thought about those bombers, the ones that had filled their skies and destroyed their cities, the ones that had been built at a rate of 1 per hour in a factory the size of a small city. In the decades after the war, many surviving Luftwaffe pilots wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and participated in historical projects aimed at documenting their experiences. A common theme in these accounts is a sense of having been caught in forces beyond human control. They described the American bomber offensive not as a military campaign but as an elemental phenomenon, like a storm or an earthquake. Major Heinz Barr, a decorated ace with 220 confirmed kills, said in a 1970 interview, "We fought well. Our aircraft were excellent. Our tactics were sound. But we were fighting history itself. The age of the individual warrior had ended, and we did not realize it until it was too late." This recognition, painful and belated, represents a kind of wisdom. The Second World War marked the full arrival of industrial modernity as the dominant force in human conflict. The romantic ideals of chivalry, honor, and individual heroism, which had survived in attenuated form through the First World War, were finally extinguished in the assembly plants of Willow Run and the skies over Germany. War had become a contest of production, logistics, and organization. The side that could mobilize its economy most effectively, coordinate its efforts most efficiently, and sustain its operations most reliably would win, almost regardless of battlefield tactics or individual courage. The bomber, more than any other weapon system, embodied this transformation. It was expensive, complex, and required thousands of people to design, build, maintain, and operate. It could not be wielded by a single hero. It demanded teams, systems, and infrastructure. It was not elegant or honorable, it was effective. And it was produced in such numbers that it became, in the eyes of those who faced it, an emblem of a new kind of power, one that was impersonal, industrial, and utterly overwhelming. Oberst Friedrich Hartmann, the pilot who sat in that frozen barracks in January 1945, staring at a photograph of American bombers, survived the war. He returned to Germany in 1947, witnessed the devastation firsthand, and eventually found work as an engineer in the reconstruction effort. In 1963 he visited the United States for the first time, attending a conference on aviation history. While in Michigan he arranged a private tour of the Willow Run plant, which by then had been partially repurposed for civilian automobile production. Standing on the floor where bombers once rolled off the assembly line, he was approached by a former Rosie the Riveter, now a grandmother who had worked at the plant during the war. She asked if he had served in the Luftwaffe. He admitted that he had. She nodded, paused, and said, "We built these to end the war. I'm sorry for what you went through, but I'm glad we did it." Hartmann later wrote that her words contained more truth than 100 histories. The bombers had not been built out of hatred or ideology, they had been built to solve a problem, and they had solved it. The story of the American bomber offensive is not, ultimately, a story about technology or even about war. It is a story about the power of organized human effort, about what becomes possible when a society mobilizes its full capacity toward a single goal. The B-24 Liberator, rolling off the Willow Run assembly line every 63 minutes, was a miracle of coordination involving tens of thousands of workers, hundreds of suppliers, and countless small innovations in process and design. Each bomber represented not just aluminum and rivets, but the collective will of a nation that had decided, however imperfectly and with whatever flaws, that fascism had to be defeated. For the German pilots who faced that collective will in the form of endless bomber streams, the experience was transformative. They had entered the war believing in the supremacy of courage, skill, and ideology. They ended it understanding that modern warfare was decided in factories, not cockpits. Some accepted this lesson with bitterness, others with resignation, and a few with something approaching respect. But all of them, whether they admitted it or not, had been changed by the encounter. They had seen the future of warfare, and it was not a knight in shining armor or an ace with 100 kills. It was a production line in Michigan, turning out bombers at a rate that defied comprehension, each one a testament to the power of abundance, organization, and the democratic industrial complex that had, for better or worse, defined the 20th century. The wind still cuts through the wire at Stalag Luft III, though the camp itself is long gone, replaced by pine forests and memorials. But the memory persists, encoded in memoirs and oral histories and fading photographs. The memory of men who had ruled the skies learning, in the most humbling way possible, that their era had ended. The age of the individual warrior, with all its romance and tragedy, had been defeated not by a better warrior but by a better system. The bomber, that ungainly four-engine machine, had become the symbol of that system, and the thunder of its engines over Europe had been the sound of the future arriving, relentless and unstoppable, 1 per hour, until the skies were full and the war was won.